All right. Good evening to everyone who is joining us. My name is Kenny Francis. I am the Vice President of Indivisible New Orleans. Thank you guys for tuning in as you guys are jumping on here. This is the last forum for the first city court judge that will be taking the election that will be taking place this Saturday. So that's August 15th. If you were unaware that you had to vote again this summer, you do have to vote again this summer on Saturday. I'm going to start first by just giving an announcement, first of all. So if you're watching this, you're probably noticing that there's supposed to be two candidates with us, and there's only one candidate with us. Unfortunately, right before we were ready to get started a few minutes ago, we learned from Marissa Hutabarat that she's unfortunately having a family emergency that is requiring her urgent attention with one of her family members. We send the best to her family, and we very much have them in our thoughts, and we hope that whatever's going on with her family works out, and that everyone's safe and that everyone's healthy. And we wish them nothing but the best. Obviously, her not being able to be here and it being sort of last minute, we wanted to make sure that we still went forward and gave Sara an opportunity to talk with voters, being as she made the time to be here, and also that the timeline. And so this is going to go a little bit different than what we had planned, because you're not going to be able to hear from both candidates. You're only going to hear from one, but we are going to give Sara the opportunity to do what we had planned. So here's how this is going to go. The way this is going to go is that, as I was going to anyway, I'm going to do a little bit of an overview of what First City Court Judge does and the most important function that everyone has on their mind. For those of you who if you haven't heard of this race at all and you're just tuning in to learn what it's about, I'm going to give you a little background of why this is important and why you definitely have to make sure you go and vote on Saturday. And then the second thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to give Sara an opportunity to introduce herself and give her a few minutes to talk about her background, about what she's about, her issues. And then we're going to get to what we didn't get to the last time during the primary. We're going to get to a Q&A where you guys, the viewers, are going to get to submit questions and she's going to answer them. I see that a bunch of you guys have submitted questions in advance, so that's great to know that we have some questions to ask her. Like I said before, obviously Marissa is not here, so she's not going to be able to answer those, and we wish her and her family the best. I'm going to let Sara go a little bit earlier than I planned to, because with just one candidate, it's going to be a little bit awkward eventually if she's just basically talking for a whole hour. And it's a lot to ask someone to just talk the whole time. And so we're going to do a little bit shorter than what we had intended, but we're going to get through as many of your questions as we can so that you guys can learn as much as you can about her before you make your decision on Saturday. And so with that, I'm going to get started by first going over just like a broad overview of First City District Court. So the First City District Court is it has jurisdictions over civil lawsuits, so it covers a lot of civil issues. So things like small claim suits. The big ballot item that folks are going to be thinking about and talking about is evictions. And that's what I'm going to spend my time here before I throw it over to Sara to introduce herself talking about, because it's the thing that's on everyone's mind. If you don't know, evictions and the crisis of evictions that you're probably reading about in the news have been an issue in New Orleans before COVID even hit. So to give you just a little bit of a background, between 2015 and 2018, according to a study done by Jane Place Neighborhood Sustainability Coalition, 24,000 New Orleanians were displaced by evictions in just a 3-year span. That's a lot of our friends and neighbors. Our eviction rate in New Orleans is double the national average. And then when you look closer and you look at some of our more vulnerable neighborhoods, it's actually closer to 4 times. This eviction crisis hits Black families, especially Black women, the hardest. And a pretty disheartening fact is that most people who are getting evicted and then going through eviction procedures in court are there because they're owing just 1 month's rent or even less than that. And most are appearing in court without the help of an attorney. So you just like listening to that, you can hear sort of how it drives systemic inequities already exist around people having stable and safe housing, with the way that evictions have become an epidemic in our city. And since COVID, it's only started to get worse. So since COVID, according to data that we have found have been put out by multiple groups, 50%, half of all renters in Louisiana are in threat or are going to be in the next few months under threat of being facing eviction proceedings. So this is a huge, huge issue in our community. And we're living in a scenario where, due to the economic impacts of COVID, hundreds of thousands of Louisianans and almost 100,000 in New Orleans alone are still out of work. That's 25% of people who live in New Orleans are unemployed. And so this is an enormous problem that we're trying to face as a community. And the first city court judge obviously can't solve it by themselves, as there are a lot of things that are preempted at the state level that isn't within the control of this specific judgeship. However, this judgeship does have judicial discretion, and the way that they choose to run their court, the way that they choose to set up their systems, and the way that they hear and decide on cases will definitely have a huge impact on people's lives. So all that said, it is incredibly important that you vote in this race on Saturday. It's incredibly important that you have done everything you can to make an informed decision, because whoever does end up in this judgeship is going to wield a lot of local power around this specific issue. And before I throw it over to Sarah, I will say, the things that are outside of the control of this specific judgeship is our governor could decide to halt evictions statewide. That is a choice that our government can make. Our federal senators can push for the federal government to push for an eviction moratorium. And so those are the types of relief that can come from above the local level that we should all be pushing for and advocating for. But at the same time, all policies is local, and we should absolutely be holding our local leaders accountable to doing everything they can. And so with that, I'm going to throw it over to Sarah, and I'm going to let her introduce herself and talk about whatever she wants to. I'm going to give you 5 minutes like I was going to, as if there was two of you here.
Sure. Okay. Well, I'm definitely going to be talking about evictions, but I guess, the more standard way would just be to introduce myself for those of you who haven't met me before. My name's Sara Lewis. As Kenny's mentioned, I'm running for first city court judge. So I grew up speaking Italian fluently. My mom moved here from Italy. My grandparents moved shortly thereafter, and I grew up translating for my family from Italian, taking my grandparents, to the grocery store, to the bank, basically anything that they needed. And while I'm probably not going to use Italian in a courtroom, one of the things that it teaches you at an early age is that people can come from really different backgrounds, really different cultures, speak completely different languages, and that they still deserve to be listened to be treated with respect, and to have their problems solved. So I went to Tulane Law. While I was in law school, I clerked for Judge Wicker on the Louisiana Fifth Circuit, and I also did an externship in domestic violence with with New Orleans Legal Aid, which is now Southeast Legal Services. After law school, I've been in private practice, and I do mainly civil litigation. So Kenny mentioned a little bit what First City Court does. So First City Court handles claims under $25,000, civil claims under $25,000. So that means things that range from car accidents, personal injury, wage and hour disputes. So if your employer owes you your last paycheck, for example, and it's under $25,000, those claims would go to First City Court. It also handles, as Kenny mentioned, evictions under $3,000. And then not this division, but it also handles small claims under $5,000. So just talking a little bit about evictions, which I know we're going to be spending more time on. As Kenny mentioned, we pre-COVID-19 had twice the national eviction rate of 5.2%. It was even higher in predominantly Black communities, where 1 in 4 people over the course of 3 years faced eviction versus 1 in 24 people. And as Kenny also mentioned, as a judge, we have limited, we can't change what the laws are. Those are at our legislative levels. But what I can do as a judge is I can make sure that everybody who comes into my courtroom knows what their rights are. Because as Kenny also mentioned, and I keep saying as Kenny mentioned, but I mean,
it's okay. We can do this more like an interview, because it's less.
Well, just so most people represent themselves in this court. They don't have an attorney. We don't have a constitutional right to an attorney for a civil case. We have a constitutional right for an attorney in a criminal case, but we don't have one in a civil case. So most people come into this court for one of probably the most difficult things in their lives, being threatened with an eviction, being threatened to lose their home, and they have to do it on their own. So it's really important. What I can do is I can make sure that they know what their actual rights are, what the law is, what their defenses could be, the types of things that they need to tell me so that I can make an informed decision. I can also make it as accessible as possible. One of the things in the Jane's Place report that Kenny was mentioning is that the majority of people who, the majority of cases that result in an eviction, actually the people do not come to court to defend themselves. And so things that I could do to make it more accessible would include, holding court at hours that are after work so that people can actually make it there. Holding court on weekends, holding court in different satellite areas, such as closer to the north, in the lower Ninth Ward and closer to New Orleans East. Even with public transportation, it can take over an hour from parts of New Orleans East to get to the courthouse. So just trying to eliminate some of these obstacles, holding as many Zoom hearings, as possible. Unfortunately, 17% of New Orleans residents don't have access to reliable access to the internet, so that wouldn't be possible in all cases. Making sure that people have paper copies of what the rules are, because as I mentioned, if people don't have access to the internet in order to look up what the rules are, they certainly won't be able to get what the having paper copies would be really important. So as I mentioned, I've done civil litigation since I graduated from law school. For the most part, I've practiced in over 20 different parishes across the state of Louisiana. I've represented both plaintiffs and defendants in a wide variety of cases, including environmental litigation. And I think representing both sides has made me a better lawyer for my clients, because I think knowing each side of the story, being able to look at something critically and understand that each side has a value, has a point, makes me a better advocate as an attorney. And I think it's also a skill that'll translate into me being a better judge, being able to know that everybody has something and to say, everybody has a point, and being able to look at each side, each party, and give them a fair chance to tell what their side of the story is without deciding a case before it comes before me. I've also, my law partner and I do CJA panel work, which is the Criminal Justice Act. And so we represent criminal defendants in federal court when the federal public defender is conflicted out because there are multiple defendants. So I've handled criminal cases as well at the federal level through the Criminal Justice Act panel. I think that also, I really appreciate being able to do that work, because as a civil litigator, this is a way that I feel like I give back to the community in a different fashion through representing people who can't afford a criminal defense attorney. So that's a bit about me. I really appreciate you, Kenny, doing this. As you mentioned, and as I hope, the people who are watching this understand, this is a very, very important court. This is where most people in our city, particularly vulnerable people, will find themselves, and making sure that we put people in office who, are considerate, take their job seriously, are compassionate, listen to everybody, and use our jobs to make people's lives as good as we can is really important. And if 2020 has taught us anything, we could use all the help we can get. So.
You came right in under 5 minutes. Well done.
Oh, I didn't even time that. I've just done this going, man.
Well done. Thank you for that, Sarah. And I'm just going to say again, because I'm seeing that people are joining as you were talking. So if you're just joining and you're wondering why Marissa Hutabarat is not here, unfortunately, right before we were to go live, we got word from her that she's had a family emergency that is requiring her urgent attention. And unfortunately, she sends her regrets that she could not be here. We wish her nothing the best, and we hope that everyone in her family is safe, and that whatever is happening with her family, that everyone comes out of it safe and healthy. And we wish her and her family the best, and that they're in our thoughts. Since Sara was here and that we were right about to go on, we decided to go forth and give her a chance to talk to y'all voters and specifically answer y'all's questions, especially since the last time we did this during the primary, we got Zoom hacked and we're unable to get to the question and answer portion. And so I do want to jump into that. And like I said, Sara, I'm going to treat this more like an interview since there's only one of you.
Okay.
And so, I'm going to try to have this be more of a conversation than it was just going to be throwing questions at both of you and having you guys give like soliloquy answers. And so I do want to jump into something that you touched on in what you're just talking about, that I think really it aligns with a question that we got that someone submitted.
Sure.
And this is also a moment, I'm sorry to take one more moment to say, if you're watching this and you would like to ask a question, you can submit a question. You just need to go to Slido, that's SLIDO.com. And once you get there, it's going to ask you for the event name. The event name is Judge Runoff. Once you enter that in, it's going to let you put in your question. If you go in there and you see a question that you like, that you would like to definitely heard, you can click like it's Facebook, and what it will do is the questions that have the most likes will pop up to the top of the screen, and I will see them because they'll prioritize them that way. So we'll get to as many of those questions as we can in the time that we have with Sara. And so just one more time, if you want to submit a question, that's Slido, that's SLIDO.com, and the event code is Judge Runoff. Thank you to those of you that submitted questions already. We do have a bunch from folks. And so I want to start first with a question that I think aligns with something that you were saying, and I think folks are interested to hear what you're saying is, in your career as a civil litigator, can you give us all an example of a specific incident or case or just like a story that you think defines the values that you would bring to judgeship? So can you talk about like a situation you've dealt with that really underlines that for you?
Sure. And I feel like this is answering the question. So something that I always think about when making decisions is when I was fresh, probably a year out of law school and private practice, I was filing on behalf of a client a temporary restraining order, and so you file a verified petition, and you verify that everything that's in this temporary restraining order petition is true and accurate. And I came to find out afterwards, after I'd filed it already with the court, that some of the information that I'd gotten was incorrect. So as a young lawyer, as a baby lawyer, the biggest fear that you have is that you're doing something wrong and that you don't even know that you're doing it wrong. You know what I mean? Like it's definitely very nerve-wracking because there's just, there's a lot going on. And so I was left with this situation that I had to call the judge, I had to call opposing counsel, we had to get everybody on the phone, and I basically had to sit there and admit that what I had put in this petition was inaccurate. And so it taught me actually like a couple of really great things, even though at the time it just made me want to like vomit. But it taught me, first of all, that you should trust your gut. You should really should listen. There's something really true and human about your gut instinct, and you should do that. But also, when you are faced with a situation that you've done something that is not right, that you later find out is not true, just take ownership of it, and take ownership of it immediately. I think it's our human instinct also to avoid doing things that cause us anxiety, or avoid apologizing sometimes as soon as one should. And so it definitely taught me that the best recourse is to own up to mistakes that you've made, to do it, to do it humbly, and to just admit that, something that you've done is not right, and to make sure, as lawyers, we have a duty, and as a judge, I would have a duty to make sure that everything that comes before the court is accurate and true. And so I think one of the lessons that it taught me is how important that is for our judicial system to work, is to make sure that we are being honest with ourselves and with the court. So I think
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to move to the next question I want to ask you is, so I want to address two elephants in the room, because I'm seeing there's several questions that folks ask that sort of try to get at this. There's a bunch of mentions about potential behaviors that either candidate has had themselves as a landlord, if you are a landlord, and also just Airbnbs. Now, I think to give some context let's state the obvious here, that there's an obvious reality that the skyrocketing cost of housing in New Orleans, that even just the 10 years that I've lived here, the rent has gone up an unbelievable amount as someone who's been renting my whole time that I lived here. And part of that has been the proliferation of Airbnbs and short-term rentals. And so there was several questions about that I'm going to combine into one 3-part question. So 2 yes/no questions and 1 an explanation. So the first yes/no question is, do you or have you owned any Airbnbs? That's a simple question that a bunch of people ask.
So no, I've never owned a house that was solely for a short-term rental. When I rented my apartment, that I was a renter for 14 years here. So I rented out the apartment that I rented 3 times, but that was it. No, I've never owned a short-term rental.
And then the second part of the question is, if you've ever been a landlord, have you ever have you ever evicted someone? And then the second part of that question is, if you're in a situation where eviction becomes something that you're considering, how would you handle that? And I love this question because I think specifically for someone who's going to be a judge that's overseeing eviction court specifically, I do think that like what you would personally do or what you have personally done does matter.
Sure.
And in a way that some other things may not apply. I think it does apply here. So I think it's a very, very good question.
I've never evicted someone. I have just recently become a homeowner for the first time. So I've always been a tenant myself. And in terms of how I would ever handle it, if that were the situation, eviction would be the last thing ever that I would want to do. I would try and come to any sort of a resolution that I could before getting to the point where I would have to evict someone. I would also, the thing is, look, if I guess hypothetically one day I could own a lot of rental properties, but assuming that that's not the case. I think there's a personal level that I, would have a relationship with the person that is living at a home that I own, and so just the idea of doing that, I would try to come to whatever agreement I could, a payment plan, reduce rent for a little while someone is going through, a certain situation. And then I would try and give, the person as many alternatives as they could, see if we could exchange something and, in terms of rent or, basically I would try to come to any other solution. And then I would try, if it was, the ultimate result that had to happen, I guess I would try and do it in the most, humane way possible. Louisiana has very, very lax rules. Like there's very little notice that needs to be given theoretically, pursuant to the law. Once an eviction is granted, people have very little time to actually move out. And, if it did get to a point where I did have to evict somebody, I would, of course, want to give people extra time to find another place, to get their things out. I would never want to put somebody's stuff, like on the street, which is what happens, when a sheriff comes after an eviction is granted. I wouldn't want to do that. So I don't know.
Thanks for answering that. Staying on that thread, because like we talked about, evictions is what's on everyone's mind, given the depth of the crisis. We have another question here about what your priorities would be as a judge who's going to be overseeing this court. And so the question, I'm just going to read it because I think it's a really good one. So as first city court judge, what will you prioritize in the way that you make your decisions? Enforcing the law as written, fairness, and they put quotes around fairness. I'm assuming it's hard to assume what they meant by putting quotes around fairness. Enforcing the law as written, fairness, renters, landlords. And so I guess the idea here is, as a judge, you do have discretion. The law says what the law says. And like you said, to put it very bluntly, Louisiana law is extremely skewed towards landlords, and it's very little renters' rights. As a person who has dealt with some issues with landlords over the years myself, there's very little that you could do. And I happen to have been in a privileged position enough where I could leave, or losing a deposit that I felt was unfair wasn't something that was going to put me in a ridiculous financial situation, even though there's a couple of times where I was in that situation. And so, the law is very, very, very much on the people side when it comes to those who can afford to be landlords and those who can afford to be renters. And so as a judge and understanding that reality, like you said, you rented for over a decade in the city yourself. What is your priority going to be as a judge? Enforcing the law as the law is written, as what the law says, fairness, prioritizing the people who are in bad situations, landlords' rights. Like, what's your take on that?
So first of all, as a judge, and as you said, I do have to enforce the law. That is, if we want changes to the fact that Louisiana has more landlord-friendly laws, we need to elect people into our legislature who can make those changes and who will do that. Other states have renters' rights bills. all across the spectrum, different things that we could do to make it more renter friendly, but that just is not something that falls within this job. So I do have a duty as a judge to apply the law. And, in response to that question, I feel like no matter, you don't want a judge to say, I'm going to be more in favor of tenants, or I'm going to be more in favor of landlords. What you want me to say, and what I will do, is that I'm going to look at each case as it comes before me. It's actually unethical for me to say how I would hypothetically rule on a situation, because imagine that's you in that position. Do you want a judge who's already made up their mind based on something before you even have a chance to tell what your side of the story is? And so, I mean, look, I definitely want to use my discretion to try and make it so that people, can stay in their homes if it's possible. But I have to apply the law when the law says that otherwise. I definitely, there was a newspaper article that I read that Judge Morial, who's one of the sitting judges currently, when the eviction ban was lifted, and when First City Court opened again after COVID. So, well, we're still in COVID, so not after COVID, but in the middle of COVID in June, she spoke with landlords who were there for an eviction, and she said, hey, can you do something? Can you give people additional time to find additional housing? Can you work with me? And so there were situations, according to the newspaper article, where, landlords grant an extra 3 months to somebody to move out. There were other situations where a landlord agreed to like a month or a few weeks. And then there were some situations where the landlord said, no, you got.
It's New Orleans. I mean, if my light's flickering, someone else's is too.
Oh yeah. The power is probably out at my house. So sorry. So, where you can use discretion and where you can work with people, especially in, this situation, I would definitely try to do that. But at the end of the day, like what everybody should want from their judges is that they're not going to decide a case before they've heard it,
I appreciate the answer. That actually spurred a question for me individually, that I wasn't able to find in my own research. So as a judge of this court, what sort of tools do you have if let's say, for just argument's sake, that like I'm a renter and I'm in court with my landlord, and my landlord's like, Kenny is late on X amount of rent and I want to evict him because blah, 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 right? Mm-hmm. What besides hearing that that case and making a decision saying, Kenny, you are evicted, you have X amount of time to get out, or no, you can't evict this person, we're going to do this, this, this. I think something that hasn't even been explained to me, and I'm sure most people watching this or that will watch this, is like, what are your options besides either granting the eviction or not?
So the parties can enter into a consent judgment, and they can agree on, I don't want to say anything because obviously not anything, like it has to be legal. But like the parties can come to agreements. You could say like, look, this person will do this maintenance or whatever, the parties can come to any agreement that they want and put it in consent judgment. They can say, okay, I'm going to pay the past due rent over the course of 3 months and take a reduction, or whatever it will be. So there are those options. One of the things that I'd like to bring to First City Court is the Louisiana Supreme Court has an Access to Justice Commission that wants to bring a completely free and voluntary mediation program to First City Court. They did it in family court really successfully in Baton Rouge, also city court in Baton Rouge. And it's where trained mediators come, and they often bring law students or other people who are seeking mediation certification, and they work with people. It's completely voluntary, so the parties have to agree to it that they want to go to a mediation, but they can go and they can mediate with a neutral third party and also come to a resolution, whatever resolution they can come to, something that's different, and any type of payment plan, and so in civil litigation, particularly for higher dollar amounts, mediation is ubiquitous. You know what I mean? Everybody goes to mediation because the cost of going to litigation is so high. The cost of going to trial is high. So people often, the majority of times try to mediate it before you get to that point. And First City Court, because the dollar amounts are less and mediation costs money, it just doesn't happen as often. So bringing this free program where people would volunteer to do it would really be something that could be a tool that people could use. Because if you can't pay for an attorney, you're most likely not going to be able to pay for a mediator.
Yeah. And so to clarify about the part you explained about you said it's a consent. Say it again, there's a consent what?
Consent judgment.
So for a consent judgment, so just to give an example so I can understand. So like, let's say I was owing on my rent. So I have a background as an educator. I could agree to tutor my landlord's kid in exchange for the rent, or something like, if I'm owing $1,000, I can pay you back $100 a month over the rest of so the landlords, but both parties would have to agree. Is it?
Yes. Yes. I can't. Yes. Exactly.
They would have to come to it. Okay. Got it.
Yes.
Thank you for that. Because I think that, like I said, one of the things I think in this conversation is it's unclear what discretion you even have as a judge besides deciding who's which side of the case you're going to rule in.
Mm-hmm.
So a question similar to that, which is the thing that I know that is outside of the purview, you don't have the ability to change the law, but the way that it's applied is literally the job, right? So something you mentioned in what you talked about when you were introducing yourself and that I talked about earlier, is that most people who appear on the tenant side appearing in court without the benefit of having an attorney helping them be represented. And I'm going to hazard a guess that if not most, a lot of landlords can afford being a landlord to have an attorney help them. And so there's sort of can be the possibility, at least, if not more than a possibility, for there to be sort of an unfair situation where you have a trained lawyer in the courtroom going up against just an average person like me who doesn't know anything about the law.
You're not average, Kenny. You're
I'm certainly not. I certainly wouldn't try to go up against a lawyer in court. I don't know anything about the law. And so so I guess my question is I get it. Civil law does it in civil law, in civil court, you're not guaranteed representation, mostly because as a society, we're not paying for it. We barely pay for public defenders. So what do you, as a judge, what do you do about that? How can people get a fair, I don't even know if you call it trial. How can you get a fair hearing there if one person's potentially got a lawyer and you're not guaranteed legal representation? You're trying to traverse the system that you likely don't understand, because the legal system is a reason why people go to law school and it's hard to go, right? Yeah. So what can people do? What could a judge do, and what would you do?
So I think this is sort of one of the things that makes First City Court just a really, unique place, and just, part of what draws me to being a judge in this court is that you do have people who represent themselves. So I had mentioned that I've practiced throughout the state of Louisiana, and I can tell you that there's a huge variety of judges, and there's a huge variety of, the way that judges act with people who come before their court. And these are in courts where mainly people are represented, civil courts, by attorneys, represented by attorneys. So I think, one of the things about First City Court that makes it such an important place is that, I feel like what I could bring is, as a judge, I can make sure that people know what their rights are. And that is my duty, is to make sure that I have to apply the law, which is something we've talked about a whole bunch, but I also have to make sure that law is correctly applied, which means that even when someone doesn't know what it is, they know, I'm here in this court and these are the facts of my case. It's my job to make sure that everybody knows what their rights are, what law applies to their cases, and that they, I completely understand that there is a disparity between somebody who has representation versus someone who's in there by themselves. And I think one of the things that makes this position so important is that people have to come in here and feel safe and comfortable and feel like they are able to have a conversation with the judge and feel like they're able to explain themselves, not feel intimidated, not feel like they are treated less than because they aren't represented because of, who they are or where they come from. And so, you've like touched on such a really important part of this job and a really important part of what this court does. If it was up to me, everybody would have civil representation for an eviction, particularly. You're threatened to lose your house. That's huge. That's probably like one of the biggest things in your life. But we don't have that. We don't have the right to that. So I think that as a judge, my job becomes ever so much more important in this courtroom versus in courtrooms where you have teams of 20 trial attorneys who have all briefed everything, know the law inside out and backwards, and are advocating for their clients on their behalf. I think having the judge, be an active, part of the litigation, and having a judge be prepared, having a judge know what's going on, and having a judge take the time to listen to the individual people who are there so that they can make sure that they know what's going on and the type of law that applies to each case. I think that it's such a, like, this is truly, I feel, the judges who are in this court are doing a true, it's a public service, right? Like we are public servants, and I am looking to be a public servant.
Thank you for that. I got two more questions for you, then I'm going to let you go.
Sure.
Thank you for, still joining us and answering the questions. So one question that I've been thinking about that was asked on here that I'm curious about your answer is, so I think a thing that I'm going to keep saying for folks here, because even reminding myself, is that despite the fact that we're electing this judge, you are not a legislator. Like, your job is to apply the law and interpret the law, which does bring to question, then why are we electing you? Like, but that's like, because you would essentially elect people to legislate, and you don't have the power to legislate. You can't change eviction law. And so it does sort of make you answer questions like the one I'm about to ask you, so I know that in order for an eviction moratorium to happen in the actual legal sense, it would have to come from the governor or some state or federal legislative lever. But as the judge of this court, could you decide to not hear eviction cases for an amount of time? Like, do you have that legal power? Like, what is the limit to your legal power to, like, I guess, pause evictions or slow down evictions during a time like a global pandemic right now?
Yeah, so the judges of First City Court don't have the ability to halt evictions on their own. On this, I've said before that this isn't a political position. Part of what the judicial canon of ethics say is that we are judges and judicial candidates have to remain apolitical. And you also want that out of your judiciary, right? You don't want people who have some sort of agenda. You want, we have separation of powers. The legislature makes the laws, and then you have, a group of people who apply them impartially, fairly, no matter who comes before them. So it's, the state legislature, the governor has the authority to continue an eviction moratorium. The federal government, the CARES Act had an eviction moratorium. I've said that before COVID-19 hit, the number one thing that I talked about when talking about this court is our eviction rate, and how we as society are just basically failing in dealing with this fact, right? We are failing to deal with the housing crisis that we have countrywide, but particularly in this state, particularly in New Orleans. And once COVID hit, the number one thing that we all knew was coming, that we read about, people have spoken about, is the fact that the issue with evictions was going to become ever more heightened. People, like you said, we had 24% unemployment rate in May. If people do not have jobs, we live in a city that relies so heavily on the service industry, right? And we can't go out, for a good reason, we're in a global health crisis. And so we really, really need our state and federal legislatures to, address this fact, halting evictions is also one side of the story, making sure people's mortgages aren't foreclosed on, making sure we don't have like mass, evictions, foreclosures, and bankruptcies throughout our state. But anyway, I guess
it's a fair point. It's a fair point. It's an entire system that are failing people from the top to bottom. And I'm gonna say one thing you said there is people wear a damn mask. Like that's not a debate. It's not a conversation. It's not even about you. It's about making sure that you're not killing your neighbors. So the last thing I want to ask you before I let you go is to go off of evictions for a second, even though that's like the number one topic folks are talking about. Can you talk a little bit about the other types of cases that appear before civil court? I have been very fortunate to not spend a lot of time or any time actually in a courtroom in my life. And so what other things would come up in front of you if you were to become the judge, and what should other people be thinking about?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. And let me just say one thing that's like sort of a joke, but not really. I tell people this all the time. I hope I don't see any of y'all in my court. You know what I mean? If I do become a judge. And I mean that because nobody wants to have an issue that they have to litigate, right? Like that's nobody's cup of tea. You'd much rather you never are wronged, you never feel like you've been wronged, or you're never accused of having done wrong so that you have to be in court. So I genuinely, Kenny, hope I do not see you. I mean, other than in forums like this has been very pleasant. Thank you so much for doing it. But
thank you for joining.
Okay. But so the other types of cases that this handles, so like I said earlier, it's basically civil claims under $25,000. And so what does that mean? So if you have a car accident and the amounts at issues are under $25,000, if you have a slip and fall and the amount is under $25,000, so personal injury claims, you hurt yourself in any way and you're, somebody else's negligence is what caused you to be hurt. Under $25,000 would be in this court. A big thing that comes before this court are wage and hour disputes. So under Louisiana law, you have to be paid your final paycheck, for example, after a certain amount of time. If that paycheck is withheld, you get attorney's fees and penalties, as well as your last paycheck. So a lot of those claims come to this court. If you have a contract dispute, so if you buy a car and it's under $25,000, it would be before this court. If you sell to your neighbor, I don't know, anything that has less than $25,000 value, and you draft up a contract and there's some breach of that contract, that would come before this court. Also something that somebody pointed out, traffic, the speeding ticket, the appeal of those decisions. Yeah, the cameras, the appeal of those decisions. So those go first to an administrative hearing, then the appeal of it goes to this court. And then somebody pointed this out, which is sort of nice. We can also, I keep saying we, but if I am elected, this court also can officiate weddings. So that's nice.
That's good to know. Yeah, that is. I'm sure those are the good days.
Yeah, that's a nice day.
Thank you for that list. So listening to you list that, I can see now the questions that we consistently got about no one that enters into this court for any of those reasons is guaranteed representation the way they are if it's criminal court. And so I can see what you mean when you say that it's very important. And I think this is a thing for folks to think about when they're voting on Saturday, having listened to both you and Marissa talk over the course of the campaign about what your values are, the way that you've handled things in your legal career. You're not just the judge, you're not just deciding. You have to make sure that everyone understands their rights. You have to make sure that the law is applied fairly, because it sounds like this court is a whole lot of people coming to court who may not know anything about the law themselves. They're just, it could be me and my neighbor who are both angry about, you're dealing with civil matters where I want to sue you over something that's not a crazy amount of money, although $25,000 is a lot of money to me.
It's a lot. And that's the thing that I point out. It's a lot of money to a lot of people. And this might not be the thing that makes headlines because it's not, it's not like a multi-million-dollar case, but this is the difference. This is a huge difference to most people in the city.
Yeah. And so I can see, and so I guess what I'm trying to impress upon with this last question that I asked is for folks who are watching or folks who will watch this, is as you go into the ballot box, I know that this is a down ballot race, and we made a joke the last time we talked about how I was surprised that we got Zoom hacked, that this was a big enough deal for because there's, like you said, this isn't one of sort of the sexy races that gets a bunch of media attention, et cetera. And it's one of the reasons why we at Indivisible chose to cover it and try to help educate people on it, because we got to vote and every single election matters. And who's running your first city district court is in a lot of ways probably going to affect specifically vulnerable members of the community more than who Joe Biden picked for vice president, which is what everyone's talking about today. And so with that, I want to say, if you haven't voted yet, because early voting did happen, so I'm sure a lot of people did vote, hopefully, you do have one more chance. Saturday, polls will be open from 7 a.m. all the way until 8 p.m. You have all day Saturday to vote. Please make a plan to vote on Saturday. If you haven't voted yet, please know where you can go vote. And
go vote. GEAUX vote.com to figure out your polling location if you don't know.
Thank you for that. And please, 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 please vote in this election and in every election. Because the thing that like most of my friends and most of the folks that know me personally will know is that I ad nauseum talk about how all politics is local. And you are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, arguing with people about the national election. I would love to see arguments about who the first city district court is and who the DA is and who the school board members are, because those races matter much, much more to our everyday lives and the lives of people in the city, and the lives of vulnerable folks in this city than anything that's happening at the national level. Thank you so much, Sara, for joining us tonight. Anyone who is watching this, the way that you can find this is that this is on our YouTube channel. So if you're watching this on YouTube, you can go back and watch from the beginning, the moment that I end the broadcast. You can share it that way as well. Thank you guys for all coming. And again, one more time, vote on Saturday, August 15th. Polls are open all day, all the way up until 8 p.m. Please vote. Thanks for joining us, Sara.
Thank you so much. And thank you everybody who was here for watching. And like Kenny said, please go vote. And thanks for, being civically engaged and watching me talk with him for the last 45 minutes.
And one last thing, one more time, we send all of our thoughts and good intentions to Marissa and her family. We hope that her family emergency turns out well and that everyone's safe and well.
Yes.
Good evening, folks.